They say if you beat the wrong man in drag racing, your career doesn't rise, it vanishes.
In 1970, one man did what almost nobody believed was possible. He strapped himself into a machine built for war, lined up against the most feared name in drag racing, and when the Christmas tree lights dropped, he won. Not just the race, the championship, the whole thing. His name was Dave Strickler. And for one moment in time, he was the best drag racer on the planet. So why have you never heard of him? Why does Bill Jenkins have statues, sponsorships, and a legacy carved into the history of American motorsport, while Dave Strickler has almost nothing? No documentaries, no Hall of Fame speeches, no million-dollar endorsements, just silence. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most overlooked stories in drag racing history. The man who beat a legend and then vanished completely. This is the story of the champion that time forgot. To understand how Dave Strickler could win everything and still lose everything, you first need to understand the world he was racing in. Because the 1960s and 70s drag racing scene was not just a sport, it was a religion. Every weekend, across hundreds of drag strips scattered through America. From California to Carolina, thousands of people would flood the bleachers. They would bring their families, their friends, their cold beers and their hot opinions. And they would watch men push machines to the absolute edge of what metal and fire could do. This was the golden age of American muscle. The factories were at war with each other. Chevrolet, Ford, Dodge, Plymouth. They were all pouring money into racing because they knew something powerful. If you won on Sunday, you sold on Monday. The cars had names that sounded like thunder. The Super Stock, the Pro Stock, the Funny Car. These weren't just vehicles, they were weapons. And the drivers? They were gladiators. Fame in this world was everything. It meant factory sponsorships. It meant your face on magazine covers. It meant your name being whispered in every garage and every gas station from coast to coast. It meant money, legacy, and immortality. But here is the thing about this world that most people never talk about. Talent alone did not make you a legend. The machine behind you made you a legend. The media behind you made you a legend. And sometimes, the most talented man in the room walked away with nothing. And in 1970, two men were about to prove exactly that. One would become a household name, the other would become a ghost. Their names were Dave Strickler and Bill Jenkins. And their story starts long before that championship run, because before they were rivals, they were something much more complicated. They were partners. Meet old reliable Dave Strickler. Dave Strickler did not grow up with fame in his eyes. He grew up with grease on his hands. Born in York, Pennsylvania, Strickler was the kind of man that small-town America produced in abundance back then. Quiet, hard-working, mechanically gifted in a way that felt almost instinctive. He did not talk much. He did not need to. His driving did his talking for him. From the moment Strickler got behind the wheel of a drag car, something became immediately clear to everyone watching. This man was different. He had that rare thing that you cannot teach and you cannot buy. He had feel, a perfect, almost surgical understanding of how to extract every last fraction of a second from a machine at the limit of its ability. He started running in the NHRA circuit in the early 1960s, and the wins began to pile up quickly. Not flashy wins, not lucky wins, consistent, methodical, dominant wins, race after race, strip after strip, Strickler delivered. And the crowd noticed. They gave him a nickname that told you everything about who he was. Old Reliable. Not the Destroyer, not the Rocket, not some aggressive, intimidating name built for marketing and fear. Old Reliable. Because when Dave Strickler lined up at the Christmas tree, you knew exactly what was going to happen. He was going to do his job perfectly every single time. Now, to a certain kind of person, that nickname sounds boring. But to the people who understood drag racing, truly understood it, that nickname was the highest possible compliment. Consistency at that level, under that pressure, in those machines, that was mastery. And it was during this rising period of his career that Strickler formed what would become one of the most important partnerships of his professional life. He teamed up with Bill Jenkins. Together, they built cars. They developed setups. They shared knowledge, split costs, and chased championships side by side. Jenkins was the engineering brain. Strickler was the driving force. Together, they were formidable. But partnerships in motorsport are fragile things, especially when both men are talented enough to stand alone. And eventually, they did. The legend called Grumpy. If Dave Strickler was the quiet professional, then Bill Jenkins was everything else. Jenkins earned his nickname the same honest way Strickler earned his. He was grumpy, famously, relentlessly, almost professionally grumpy. He had little patience for fools, less patience for journalists, and absolutely zero patience for anyone who wasted his time. But the man was a genius. Bill Jenkins understood engines the way a surgeon understands the human body, not just the parts, but the relationships between the parts, the tolerances, the pressures, the invisible margins where performance either lived or died. He could take a factory engine, tear it down to nothing, and rebuild it into something that defied what anybody thought was mechanically possible. And unlike Strickler, Jenkins understood something else too. Something that, in the long run, would matter just as much as horsepower. He understood the game off the track. Jenkins was quotable. He was opinionated. He had a personality that filled a room and a media presence that filled pages. When a journalist needed a story, Jenkins gave them one. When a factory needed a face for their program, Jenkins fit the frame. He was the whole package, the performance, the engineering credibility, and the personality. Sponsorships came to him. Magazine features came to him. The industry gravitates toward people like Jenkins because people like Jenkins make the industry look exciting. And here is where the contrast between these two men becomes impossible to ignore. Same era, same cars, same tracks, same championship battles, but only one of them had a machine behind him. Not a racing machine, a marketing machine. Jenkins had factory backing from Chevrolet's performance division. He had resources Strickler could only dream of. He had the infrastructure, the support crew, the budget to develop and experiment endlessly. Strickler was running leaner, scrappier, making it work with less, relying almost entirely on his own ability to compensate for whatever gap existed in resources. And still, when they faced each other on the strip, Strickler more than held his own. Which is exactly what made 1970 so extraordinary. Because that year, Dave Strickler did not just hold his own against Bill Jenkins, he destroyed him. And then the world looked the other way. The race that should have changed everything. Let's talk about the 1970 NHRA Pro Stock season. Because what happened that year deserves to be talked about. It deserves to be celebrated. And for too long, it has been treated like a footnote when it should have been the headline. Pro Stock was the new class on the block in 1970. The NHRA had introduced it just that year, purpose-built race cars that looked like production vehicles but performed like nothing that had ever come out of a factory. This was the cutting edge. This was where the best drivers and the best engineers came to prove they were the best in the world. And from the very beginning of that season, two names kept rising to the top: Jenkins and Strickler. Jenkins came in with everything. The factory muscle behind him, a car dialed to perfection, the weight of expectation and the machinery of promotion already working in his favor. The racing press had essentially coronated him before the season even started. He was the story. He was supposed to be the champion. Strickler came in with his reputation, his precision, and that quiet relentlessness that had defined his entire career. Race by race through that season, Strickler was immovable. Every time the pressure mounted, every time it looked like Jenkins and his superior resources would pull away, Strickler answered, "Clean launches, perfect reaction times, mechanical sympathy that kept his car together while others were shaking themselves apart." The championship came down to the Nationals, the biggest stage in American drag racing. Packed grandstands, factory representatives watching from the timing tower, the whole world of the sport holding its breath. Strickler lined up. The Christmas tree counted down. The lights dropped. And Dave Strickler did what he had done his entire career. He was perfect. He claimed the NHRA Pro Stock Championship in the very first year the class existed. He beat the man everyone said was unbeatable. He stood at the top of the sport at its most significant moment of the era. The crowd erupted. His crew erupted. For one blazing moment, Dave Strickler was exactly where his talent had always told him he belonged, right at the top. And then, almost immediately, the silence began. The vanishing. Here is what should have happened after Dave Strickler won that championship. Factory deals, magazine covers, his name attached to products, to programs, to the next generation of American performance cars. His story should have been told 1,000 times over in 1,000 different publications. He should have become the face of Pro Stock's explosive debut season. That is what should have happened. Here is what actually happened. The phone calls went to Jenkins, not because Jenkins had won, he hadn't, but because Jenkins was Jenkins, the name already embedded in the industry's consciousness, the personality already wired into the media's Rolodex. The infrastructure around Jenkins simply continued operating, continued growing, continued building his legacy, regardless of what the scoreboard said. And Strickler? Strickler had no such machine working for him. This is the first and perhaps most brutal reason for his disappearance. In professional motorsport, talent wins races, but money and media build legacies. Strickler had won on talent alone. And when the race was over, there was nothing behind him to convert that win into lasting power. The factory support never materialized the way it needed to. Without significant corporate backing, running at the front of Pro Stock became an increasingly expensive proposition. The sport was evolving rapidly. The cars were getting faster, more sophisticated, more expensive to develop with every single season. The gap between well-funded operations and underfunded ones was widening at a frightening rate. Strickler was fighting that battle every year, trying to stay competitive against operations that had 10 times his resources. It is exhausting in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate unless you have lived it. Not just physically exhausting, financially exhausting, emotionally exhausting. But there is something else, something that gets overlooked almost entirely in the few discussions that do exist about Strickler's career. The man had a different relationship with the spotlight than most of his contemporaries. Strickler was not chasing fame, he was chasing the perfect run. Those are two very different pursuits, and in the media-driven world of 1970s motorsport, only one of them kept your name alive. Jenkins gave interviews. Jenkins had opinions on everything and shared them loudly. Jenkins was a character, the grumpy genius who would bend your ear for an hour about carburetor tuning and somehow make it the most compelling conversation you had all week. That personality was gold for journalists who needed to fill pages. Strickler let his driving speak, and when the cameras were off, his driving didn't have a voice. By the mid-1970s, Strickler's presence in the sport began to fade. Not all at once. There was no single dramatic exit. No crash, no scandal, no public breakdown. Just a gradual withdrawal. Fewer race entries, less visibility. A name that appeared in results less and less frequently until eventually it stopped appearing at all. The champion had simply gone home. And racing history, without ever making a conscious decision to do so, closed the door behind him. What history stole from him? Let's be completely honest about what happened here, because it deserves honesty. Dave Strickler did not fade from history because he wasn't good enough. He faded from history because the system that creates legends in motorsport was never built for men like him. Look at Bill Jenkins today. the legacy is extraordinary. Hall of Fame inductions, books written about his engineering philosophy, his name still spoken with reverence in every serious drag racing conversation. He influenced generations of builders and racers who came after him. His impact on the mechanical development of pro stock is genuinely, undeniably significant. One of that is false. Jenkins earned his place in history through real work and real achievement. But here is the uncomfortable truth sitting right next to that legacy. Dave Strickler beat him. The man who history says is the godfather of pro stock, the man whose engineering was supposed to be untouchable, was outdriven in the championship year by a quiet guy from Pennsylvania who just wanted to race. And yet one of those men is a legend, and the other is a question most drag racing fans cannot answer. Why does this happen? How does this happen? Because history is not a neutral document. History is written by the people with the resources, the platforms, and the personalities to write it. It is shaped by money and media and narrative momentum. The best story does not always win. The loudest story wins. The best funded story wins. Jenkins had all of those things working for him. Strickler had none of them. Think about how many other Dave Stricklers there are out there. Not just in racing, in every sport, every field, every arena of human competition. People who were genuinely the best at what they did, who achieved real and significant things, who then disappeared without a trace because no one was telling their story. It is a particular kind of injustice, not a dramatic one, not one with a villain you can point to and blame. Just the slow, quiet erasure of a man who deserved better from the world he gave so much to. Dave Strickler didn't lose to Bill Jenkins on the track. He outdrove him. He won the championship. He lost to a world that decided his story wasn't worth telling. The man behind the helmet. But here is what I want you to hold on to as we near the end of this story, because it would be very easy and very wrong to frame Dave Strickler as a victim, as a sad figure, as a man who spent his final years staring at the wall, replaying the moments where history turned away from him. It would make for a more dramatic ending, maybe, but it would not be the truth, and this story deserves the truth. There is real evidence, and it matters deeply, that Dave Strickler was not a broken man. He did not carry the weight of bitterness the way some men in his position might have. He did not spend his post-racing years giving angry interviews about the recognition that never came, or measuring his life against Jenkins's legacy with resentment in his eyes. That was simply not who he was. When the racing slowed down, Strickler did what felt completely natural to him. He went home. And importantly, back to cars. Always back to cars. Because for Dave Strickler, cars were never really about the trophy or the crowd or the magazine cover. They were about the thing itself, the engineering, the feel. That beautiful, almost meditative relationship between a driver who truly understands his machine and a machine that responds to being truly understood. He remained active in the automotive world in a quieter capacity for years. Not on the big stage, not under the lights, but in the kind of settings where real knowledge lives. Workshops, local events, conversations with people who genuinely loved the sport and wanted to learn from someone who had lived it at the highest level. And here is the thing that people who encountered him in those years consistently say. He was generous, genuinely, freely generous with his time and his knowledge. If you found Dave Strickler and you had a real question, he would give you a real answer. Not a guarded, protect my secrets answer. Not the kind of answer designed to maintain mystique or leverage. He would just tell you what he knew because he respected the craft enough to want it passed on properly. He was warm. He was humble in the way that only truly confident people can be humble, not performing modesty, but actually unbothered by the need to be seen as the most important person in the room. He was, by all accounts, at peace. And I think that peace came from something very specific, something that no amount of media coverage or Hall of Fame voting could ever give a man or take away from him. He knew what he had done, not what the record books said, not what the magazine articles said. What he knew, in his own bones, in his own memory. He had lined up against the best competition in the world, in the most important race of the era, and he had been better than all of them. He had been perfect when it mattered most. You cannot revise that. You cannot sponsor that away. You cannot outmarket that truth into non-existence. It happened. He was there. He knew. There is a certain kind of man, rare, genuinely rare, who can hold a truth like that privately and find it enough, who does not need the external validation to confirm what he already knows internally. His nickname was Old Reliable, and even in the way he handled the silence that followed his greatest achievement, he lived up to it. No drama, no collapse, no bitter public exit. Just quiet dignity and a life built around the things he actually loved. The tragedy, when you sit with this story long enough, shifts. It is not Strickler's tragedy. Not really. He built a good life. He kept his integrity. He stayed connected to the thing he loved most. He went to bed at night knowing what he had accomplished, even if the world outside his window had forgotten. The tragedy belongs to us. To every drag racing fan who grew up never knowing the name of Pro Stock's first champion. To every young driver who came through the ranks without his example to study, his story to draw courage from. To the sport itself, which lost one of its purest stories to the same machine that was busy making other stories louder. We were robbed. Not of his happiness, he kept that, but of his story. Of the chance to know him, to celebrate him, to let him stand in the light he absolutely, undeniably earned. Old Reliable gave everything to a sport that was not always built to give back equally, and he never complained about it once. That, more than any championship, might be the most remarkable thing about Dave Strickler. In 1970, Dave Strickler did the impossible. He entered the most competitive new racing class in America. He went up against the man the entire industry had already decided was going to be the champion. He had fewer resources, less backing, less of everything the sport told you that you needed to win. And he won anyway. Clean, dominant, undeniable. He was the best drag racer in the world. For one season, the scoreboard said so in plain language that required no interpretation. And then the machine that was supposed to carry his name forward simply did not exist. And the world moved on. And his name got quieter and quieter until most people in the sport had never heard it at all. Bill Jenkins is a legend. He deserves much of that. But the story of Pro Stock's first champion belongs to someone else. It belongs to the quiet man from Pennsylvania who showed up, outdrove everybody, and never asked for anything more than a fair race. Dave Strickler was the champion that time forgot. Now you know his name. And if you think stories like this one deserve to be told, if you believe the people history overlooked deserve to have someone go looking for them, then subscribe. Because this channel exists for exactly that reason. We find the names that got buried, and we bring them back